Everyone who plays competitive Pokemon will frequently encounter moments when they realize something on their team has to die. Whether you're dealing with a threatening breaker or your team is just very weakened, you'll have a lot of these moments. Sometimes kills can happen by surprise. It can be an unexpected Terra, unusual coverage, a critical hit, or even just a bad roll. But when you know a kill is coming and something on your team has to die, you can take control of this situation. Other times, you perhaps could avoid losing a Pokemon on your team, but it's actually better to let something on your team die than let a more valuable team member take damage. Letting one of your own Pokemon die intentionally is called sacking in the competitive Pokemon community. In this video, I'm going to explain how to know if you should sack, how to determine which Pokemon is the least valuable, and some general tips, exceptions, and mistakes when it comes to sacking. I'll be using the main singles competitive format, Smogon OU, for examples, but the concepts I explain in this video will apply to many formats. Also, the team I'll be using in every example is in the description. I'll mention the relevant sets on my team as they come up in the video, but if seeing the exact team importable would help you understand the examples better, there it is. Now, before we talk about how to sack, we've got to talk about when to sack. Lots of inexperienced players sack Pokemon way too early just because there's a threat on the field or their Pokemon is at low health. I've often heard it said that low-level players are allergic to switching, and I agree. The idea here is pretty simple. If you can avoid a Pokemon dying, pick that route, unless the health of another Pokemon is worth more than keeping your least valuable Pokemon alive. I know that's a bit wordy, so let's take a look at an example to make things clear. First, we'll see a case where someone shouldn't have sacked their Pokemon, but did. On turn 13, my opponent switches their Zapdos to my Ogerpon. Even though Zapdos is defensive, it was previously knocked off by Rillaboom and is entering on Stealth Rock, so Ivy Cudgel will clearly 2-hit KO here. My opponent has two Pokemon that can comfortably take two Ivy Cudgels, Galarian Slowking and Scizor. Both are at 100%, and my opponent can clearly see that I've dealt Choice Banded damage, so they know an Ivy Cudgel is coming out. It may seem like Zapdos is useless since it's at 23% and I have Stealth Rock up, but this isn't the case at all. My opponent has Great Tusk for removal and Alomomola to potentially heal up Zapdos. Furthermore, Zapdos is just really good against my team. Look at this, nothing likes taking Volt Switch and Hurricane except Alolan Muck, which has no way to heal other than grassy terrain and will eventually be worn down. Switching Zapdos on Ogerpon was a mistake to begin with, but it would be another mistake to let it go. It would cost very little here to go into Glowking or Scizor. But my opponent lets Zapdos go. This is an example of an unnecessary sack. Losing health on Glowking or Scizor was definitely worth preserving Zapdos. Even if my opponent never managed to remove Stealth Rock, Zapdos would still be a valuable sack to have and allow my opponent a safe switch later. On top of that, it could block a potential Rapid Spin from my Great Tusk. A Pokemon dying to entry hazards is a surprisingly strong position, allowing you to prevent all removal and switch into the strongest Pokemon for whatever's on the field. It also ensures that your opponent can't use your attempted sack as setup fodder, meaning they boost their stats with moves like Dragon Dance or Calm Mind when you were hoping to just be KO'd right away, and then you can safely switch into a counter. Many low-level players consider a Pokemon useless once it's dead to entry hazards, but in a lot of cases, dying to entry hazards is a lot better than being left at low health. This is an important part of sacking. If you have a Pokemon that dies to entry hazards immediately when it comes in, if it costs you little to preserve it, it's almost always a good idea to keep it around. Now for an example of where a Pokemon should be sacked. I'm in an endgame situation, and I'm first going to just finish off this Ribombee here, but after this comes in a Maushold, which is a bit threatening for my team. Now, it takes a big Make It Rain here, and thanks to that choice specs, it still takes a ton of damage. Now, I'm at a point where this Maushold cannot kill me with Bite. It does have Technician as well, and there is that flinch chance, but as long as I don't get flinched, I can get past this Maushold without losing a single Pokemon. However, I decide to switch to Muck and let it die. I knew it would be important to keep Gholdengo healthy to deal with Hawlucha later. So, in the case of dealing with this Maushold, I could have avoided losing a Pokemon, but I needed Gholdengo healthy. Muk's life was worth less than health on Gholdengo, so I sacked Muk, and you see that ended up being a very good idea. So now you have a better idea of when to sack and when not to sack. Let's suppose you've determined that something has to die, or the loss of health to avoid a death isn't worth it. How do you decide what should die? Well, to put it simply, if something has to die, you should sack the least useful Pokemon on your team. Lower level players get this wrong surprisingly often. They typically leave whatever is on the field to die, forgetting that they can just switch. For example, on turn 10 of this game, my opponent and I both switched to our Ogerpon. I can't switch into Ogerpon Cornerstone well at all. I could Terra Grass with my Ogerpon, stay in, eat an Ivy Cudgel, hope I don't get critical hit, and avoid a death entirely, but my Ogerpon is really important this game. Iron Moth has already used its booster energy, and it's been forced out by Moltres Roar. Dragonite was tricked a Choice Specs earlier by my Gholdengo, so Ogerpon is very well positioned, especially that it can take Thunderclaps from Raging Bolt easily, and it even has superpower for Kingambit. So I really don't want to lose health on my Ogerpon, and especially not risk an Ivy Cudgel critical hit that would just KO me. But nothing else on my team comfortably switches in. Something has to die. So what is my least valuable Pokemon here? There are a few things to consider when deciding what you should sack. The first is health. Pokemon with lower health are generally less valuable, but not always. The second is how much damage the Pokemon can do to the opponent's team. Does the opponent have a way to wall this Pokemon? And if so, do you have a way to wear that wall down? In other words, does this Pokemon force progress in your favor? The third thing to consider is if that Pokemon is defensively important. Is it the only thing standing in the way of a threat on your opponent's team? The ideal Pokemon to sack is one that is at low health, doesn't threaten your opponent's team offensively, and isn't defensively important. But rarely will it be so easy. You may have several Pokemon on your team that have one or two of these factors, but not all three. In this example, my lowest health Pokemon is Moltres at 15% health. Moltres also isn't an offensive threat to my opponent at all. The only thing it can do real damage to is Kingambit with Flamethrower. It is, however, quite defensively good. It could potentially roost on a Kingambit or a Dragonite locked into Earthquake. And even if I never get to heal up with Moltres, that 30% Flame Body is pretty nice for fishing, and I can ensure that it's never used as setup fodder thanks to Roar. My Gholdengo is another option to sack. It's at 100% health, but since I tricked my Choice Specs to Dragonite earlier this game, it's a lot weaker. This set also doesn't have Focus Blast, so I can't threaten Kingambit at all. Gholdengo is also not really an offensive threat here. Both Raging Bolt and Kingambit can use it as setup fodder. My other team members aren't real options. My Alolan Muk is at 100% health and is great for dealing with Iron Moth and Raging Bolt, especially this Alolan Muk actually has Stone Edge, so it's really good for dealing with Iron Moth. Rillaboom is the only priority I have, which could be very important for a Terra Kingambit endgame. And I've already explained why Ogerpon is so good here. I definitely don't want to let that go. And Great Tusk is very healthy and extremely important here for these remaining sweepers, both offensively and defensively. So ultimately, I decide to U-turn here, and I sack Gholdengo. Despite being much healthier than Moltres, the risk is that Gholdengo ends up as setup fodder, and that was just a risk that was too high to ignore here. A big mistake that I see low-level players make is that they only consider health when sacking. I like this example because you can see that I let Gholdengo, a Pokemon at 100% health, die instead of a 15% Moltres. How offensively and defensively important a Pokemon is very relevant, often more so than health. I also want to elaborate a bit on offensive importance, since this is a concept I see a lot of people get wrong. When deciding if something is an offensive threat or not, you want to look at the current game state, not what might happen later. If you preserve a Pokemon that isn't offensively good now in the hopes that it will be later, you're probably playing in a wishful manner. I've seen people preserve their Swords Dance Ceruledge against stall teams and sack much more valuable team members just because Ceruledge just wins if Dondozo dies. And that might be true, but why would your opponent just let Dondozo die? They won't. If you have a threatening physical breaker that you think has a good chance of wearing down Dondozo, like say you've got a Dragon Fang, Terra Dragon, Outrage Dragonite, then sure, keep Ceruledge around. But a lot of the time, I see people overestimate the value of an offensive Pokemon just because it's good against most of the team. It doesn't matter if a Pokemon is great against 5 out of 6 team members, if the 6th is a hard wall. Wishful playing and wishful sacking isn't exclusive to offensive teams, though. Defensive archetypes do this as well. Let's look at an example. Now, right off the bat this game, I could see that my opponent had a bad matchup. Only Galarian Weezing as a grass resist to a grass spam team with Swords Dance, Woodhammer, Rillaboom, and Choice Band Ogerpon. If that Galarian Weezing gets chipped, my opponent is in serious trouble. Now, I managed to trick my Gholdengo's Choice Specs to a Toxapex, which will be relevant later. On turn 12, my opponent makes a serious mistake. They leave in their Galarian Weezing, bringing it down to just 9% health after taking a Headlong Rush, just to Will-O-Wisp my Great Tusk. After forcing the Weezing out, I set Stealth Rock, effectively killing Weezing until Iron Treads manages to remove. I immediately go into Rillaboom afterward, thinking my opponent will want to remove Stealth Rock with Iron Treads, and knowing that grassy terrain will allow Gholdengo to comfortably switch in, but my opponent goes to Toxapex, much to my surprise. I go for Swords Dance, knowing Toxapex will be choice locked into something, and I'm pleased to see that they click Infestation and not Toxic. Now here I've got a super powerful Woodhammer ready to hit. I'm expecting my opponent to let go of their Galarian Weezing, but instead, they let Toxapex go down. That was a huge mistake. Now sure, Toxapex was locked into Choice Specs, but it was actually the only switch-in my opponent had to my Muck. Knockoff, Drain Punch, and Poison Jab are now devastating for my opponent to deal with. Toxapex could switch in forever, and it'd be even better if it managed to get its Choice Specs knocked off by Muck at some point. So why did they do this? Why did they sack a valuable Pokemon when they had this 9% health Galarian Weezing here that was dead on entry? I'm guessing it was wishful playing. Galarian Weezing is their only grass resist, making it theoretically very defensively important, if it wasn't itemless at 9% health and with Stealth Rock up. I think my opponent was playing for the scenario where they somehow remove Stealth Rock with Iron Treads and manage to Wish Pass to Galarian Weezing from their Alomomola. But realistically, I'm never going to let that happen. Keeping Weezing alive here was a mistake created by a hopeful situation that was never realistically going to occur. Much like Ceruledge Hyper Offense players just hoping their opponent sacks Dondozo for some reason, my opponent was just hoping I let them remove hazards and Wish Pass into their Weezing. Let's look at a very similar example where my opponent made the right choice. I Rapid Spin, and my opponent kills my Great Tusk with a Brave Bird. Ting-Lu was chipped earlier, so this is a great time for my Choice Specs Gholdengo to go for Shadow Ball. Now my opponent likely wasn't expecting Choice Specs and didn't think Corviknight would end up taking so much damage. When facing an Ogerpon and Rillaboom team, you really don't want to let your Corviknight get this low. It would be great for my opponent if Corviknight could become healthy again. Perhaps with Roost, maybe could roost up on a Muck, but realistically, am I ever going to let this happen? Absolutely not. So, at the first moment I pressure my opponent with Ogerpon here, my opponent cuts their losses and lets the Corviknight go. It's just not worth keeping this Pokemon around at such low health. They very well could have sacked other Pokemon and hoped in vain that their Corviknight could somehow come back, but they made the right play, not the wishful play. So, in summary, if you can avoid sacking, you generally should take that route. The exception is if the health of another Pokemon in your team is more valuable than the life of your sack. When deciding a sack, you should consider health, offensive utility, and defensive utility. And you shouldn't be wishful. Look at the current game state and be realistic about which Pokemon will put in work and which Pokemon won't put in work. There is only one exception to this decision flowchart. there is a case where you should sack a more valuable Pokemon instead of a less valuable Pokemon. That's if the more valuable Pokemon is on the field and the Pokemon you're sacking to might set up. In this endgame, Ogerpon is pretty amazing. It gets a nice Defiant boost from this Bitter Malice from a Zoroark here, and just kills this Great Tusk. But Ogerpon looks really, really good here. So Booster Moth, especially if this is special attack, it's really good against this. It can outspeed Tusk, it can outspeed Ninetales, it can come in and superpower Kyurem once it's no longer locked into Ivy Cudgel. So Ogerpon looks really great in this endgame. Now, my least valuable Pokemon is probably Great Tusk at this point. If you look, it's not matching that up that well into my opponent's team, and this Kyurem is very threatening. You'll see I lost my Ice Resist, so something probably does need to go down here. So ideally, Tusk is the one that goes down. But if I switch my Ogerpon out and go into Great Tusk, and this Kyurem Dragon Dances twice, I might just lose the game right there to Icicle Spear. I do not have close combat on my Tusk. It would just have to click Headlong Rush. A double DD into Icicle Spear would be tragic. And I'm not in that dire of a situation that I can't afford to lose Ogerpon. I'd rather lose Tusk than Ogerpon, but I cannot risk this Kyurem setting up. So I stay in and click Ivy Cudgel. And fortunately, my opponent dances, meaning I can Terra Grass to outspeed the Kyurem and just finish it off next turn. So in this case, Ogerpon was a more valuable Pokemon, but I risked sacking it because I really could not afford to let that Kyurem Dragon Dance. Well, that's pretty much all there is to know about sacking. If you enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing and leaving a like. Let me know in the comments if you learned something or if you have anything to add. Now go out there and let your Pokemon die like a pro. I'll see you guys next time.